really nice question from Webb, because it will segue us beautifully into our next two speakers that we have. So I'm not sure how you two have worked it out, but I would like to introduce both Kelly and Webb. So Kelly Marriott Statham is a registered nurse who's passionate about the thoughtful nursing care of older persons and believes that context has a significant influence on a practitioner's ability to engage in person-centred processes. Kelly's a lecturer at the University of Wollongong, and she's a PhD candidate at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, where she's exploring how shared decision-making occurs between older persons and nurses in residential aged care facilities, and doing some really interesting research. I'm looking forward to what Kelly has to say. And then just so it can be seamless between Kelly and Webb, I'd also love to introduce Dr. Webb Tiagi, who's a Senior Academic Research Fellow at the University of Sydney. He's also the Digital Director of the Person-Centred Practice ICoP. He's trained as a neuroscientist and a cognitive and social psychologist. His research includes person-centred nursing practice, questionnaire development, and nursing theory generation. And he's currently working with Professor Brendan McCormack on exploring the nuances of the constructs within the person-centred practice framework and demystifying the relationships between them. So thank you so much to both Kelly and Webb. I'll hand over to you both.
Thanks, Beck. I'm first, and then Webb's going to go after me. That's how we organised it. Thank you. I'm Kelly. I first of all would like to acknowledge I'm on Dharawal country here, where I work, where I live, and also where I conducted this research that I'm going to be presenting you today. I am going to talk about my PhD research journey, and I guess a little bit more about the sort of practicalities. And Emma just alluded a lot to this in her presentation, so that's a great segue for me too. So I've been researching how older people and nurses make shared decisions together in a residential aged care facility. My research is obviously embedded and underpinned in the world of person-centredness and sits within the Centre for Person-Centred Practice Research. I'm also a member of PCP-ICoP, which I mentioned earlier as well, and I couldn't have got here without my wonderful supervisors, first and foremost Professor Jan Dewing, and Dr. Caroline Dixon and Dr. Michelle Hardeman. Could you go to the next slide, please, Webb? As I said, I'm focusing on shared decision making and how the practice environment, because context is important to me, influences an older person to participate in that shared decision making process with a nurse. Being a registered nurse and working in residential aged care, I was really fascinated with how decisions are made with, sometimes for, older people in this setting. It's pretty complex, it's diverse, it really depends on the practitioner and the older person. So decision making and facilitating choice in aged care is found in like every policy, standard, guideline, almost in rhetoric, and was obviously highlighted by the Royal Commission by our government that was held into the quality and safety of aged care in Australia, which spanned many years but concluded in 2021. And what I experienced and observed from working in aged care in practice is that decision making and choice is not always enabled in a place that is really fraught with like routine and rigidity and sort of task orientation. So I wanted to research what the interrelationships between the practice environment and the attributes of the person-centred practice framework are that facilitate shared decision making between a nurse and an older person. And I mean all kinds of decisions. I mean like what time we're going to get up for the day, what we're going to wear, all the things that maybe are perceived as littler decisions but have a big impact on people's quality of life. Next slide, please. So my theoretical framework is presented here in a bit of a collage. Brendan talked earlier about exploring philosophical underpinnings of what a person is, what person-centeredness is. And I did all of that over many years. It felt like it would never end. And this was about a deep dive into who I am, how my environment has shaped me in my life and enabled me to learn throughout my life as well. There was a couple of philosophers, Martha Nussbaum and Brian Fay's ideas that I really resonated with me. They both sit in the critical theory paradigm, which is where I find myself housed. And through all of this, I found and came to settle on a couple of principles: that each person is a subject, not an object. Each person has the right to their own values, beliefs, and emotions. And actually, emotion is a part of our existence as a person and how we get meaning from the world. That we as persons need to be around each other, that we're relational, that values are socially constructed. A person's reality comes from their own environment. Knowledge is gained through being in the world, interacting with other persons. Power is also constructed and realized in this social context. And of course, that there is not one single reality or truth, that we all have different perceptions of reality. So person-centeredness for me underpins this research. And considering specifically older persons and their decisions, I found that decision-making process is notably different. With age, there is increased reliance on emotions, past experiences, values. The more experiences you have, the better you are at making decisions. Would you believe that? So, and neuroscience confirms this too. So my theoretical framework is all about respect for persons, that being a person is about being in relation, being in place, being in time. Emotions are core to who we are as a person, and that actually our choices and decisions are the ultimate expression of who we are as a person and our personhood. And that photo there of me and Eunice there in the middle, this is a photo that I have permission to share, and this is my reminder for why this research is important and what's it all about. So in the next slide, I have my methodological framework, which was all informed by all this stuff that I was just talking about. The intertwining of Martha Nussbaum's capabilities for human development, the person-centered research principles, and Brian Fay's enlightenment, emancipation, and empowerment form all of my methodology. My principles are there in the middle about choice, respect for a person as a chooser, that choice is our ultimate expression of who we are as a person, remember. Emotions are another one to say that these are expressions of our personhood, our values and our lived experience, being in relationships, and power as well. So power needs to be acknowledged and shared. But getting to the nitty-gritty of my presentation in the next slide, undertaking all this theoretical work was great. But when I went actually into practice, after I had laid down all the groundwork and foundations for how I'm going to approach it, that was really important for how I was going to be a person-centered researcher. But I made this mean because I imagined the research would be a lot of time spent with persons discussing all the things that I wanted to talk about. And Emma said something about pushing hopes aside for research and working with what is actually happening in practice, and that's what I felt. The reality of actually doing research at the moment in residential care is that there's massive COVID outbreaks. I really didn't factor in how much PPE and antigen testing I would be going through. These two things were absolutely not in my ethics application, that's for sure. I was really struck by how much organisational policy and procedure I would need to wade and sort of peer through to get to the actual doing of the research. And actually finding a residential aged care facility to open their doors to me was really hard. It was not only COVID-19 that was blocking out non-essential visitors, but I'd almost say that there was gatekeepers that wouldn't even let me get past administration levels to talk to other people in the sort of micro kind of context, maybe care managers, to see if anyone would be interested in undertaking my research there. And I guess there's huge context around this too. I understand and acknowledge that people are scared. They don't want to open themselves up to any more criticism within the aged care sector, possibly burnt out from the millions of reforms that they're both preparing for and that have been rolled out as well. But I finally found a residential aged care facility that was excited to have me, and I was excited to be there too. And when we got through to ethics approval and their legal department to look through all of that, and I had long discussions with the ethics committee about why I didn't need to prove that every older person needed to have capacity to consent. We finally got there. And when I was finally in the doors behind my PPE, armed with my ethics application, what I did see was what Helen talked about this morning, that disease of busyness. I'd definitely say there was an outbreak of this disease, which is much more concerning than COVID-19 probably. And most of the nurses were too busy to talk to me, or they'd schedule a time, then they'd cancel it, or they'd come later, or want to come earlier. There's largely an unregistered workforce as well in residential aged care in Australia that doesn't have standards of practice and work in a sector that they aren't even remunerated for appropriately. They are also seen as a lesser nurse in comparison to registered nurse working there, but they're the ones that are making important decisions with older people in aged care. I definitely saw that person-centeredness was espoused in interviews that I did with nurses and in the organisation mission and values. It's even in the aged care quality standards, which they talked about, but it wasn't always observed in my research. And I guess the hardest thing for me too was that I valued and talked a lot about how emotions are an expression of who we are. But these were definitely dampened by the layers of PPE, and it was really hard to build relationships and trust with people who couldn't see my face or I couldn't see their face. So on the last slide, and just to finish up, I actually right on brand with today and how Brendan kicked off the day, I suppose, is the question that I wanted to pose for the group to you. And just to hold in your heads and respond after Vaibhav has presented. But how do you go into an organisation as an outsider and research with persons who are in a highly regulated, stressed, rigid and structured environment? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you, Beck, for the introduction. I'll do that on screen. I think a lot can be said about, especially the last question that you asked, Kelly, and I think we've had a discussion lately about how some of the frameworks or the ways of working can be so rigid that people don't even have the ability to express the creativity that we expect from them. Brendan and I have talked a lot about a potential for innovation in nursing and how that is almost taken as it is, that it exists and it should exist, and it falls on the practitioner, while some of the organizational systems, for example, might not be in place where people might even feel like they can express their creativity or they can be innovative in the way they do things. So there is a lot of discussion, I think, that interesting discussion that can be had about the last point. I am going to take a different sort of route. I'm a last minute addition to the program, so I'm going to be talking about some new developments in quantitative understanding of person-centered practice. So obviously I'm coming from the quantitative point of view, but as I said earlier, I think I don't see the world as just quantitative or just qualitative. I think these are just methodology or philosophies that they're based in, and no matter which one you believe in, there can be multiple ways of looking at the world and the reality that we live in. So that's the sort of stance that I take in my own research. So I'm going to be touching a little bit on some future directions, especially at Sydney, working with Brendan, we have been thinking about, and some of the challenges that we are hoping to tackle. So this has already been introduced by Brendan as well as other speakers today. Person-centered practice framework has been adopted globally, and sorry, I'm just going to move my window here. It's difficult to control the slide as well as present. There are multiple, so person-centered practice inventory and person-centered practice care are two questionnaires that have come out as a result of this framework, which are based on this framework. So the framework is the theoretical underpinning for both of these questionnaires. And these questionnaires, I think we are mostly familiar with it. They have been translated and culturally adapted in different parts of the world, in different languages. And in terms of the structure, so in this presentation, I'm just going to talk about PCP-IS, but it's important to briefly mention that PCP-I Care C also exists and is in the process of being published soon. And it'll be released on, a copy is already available on the website for you to download. But PCP-IS is the staff version of the inventory, and it has 59 questions. So these questions are also called items when we refer to them in statistical terms. These 59 items are then rated on an agreement scale. So if you look at this figure on the bottom right side of the screen, you'll see that there are these 59 questions are then asked, people are asked to rate how strongly they disagree or how strongly they agree on a scale of 0 to 4 or 1 to 5. And it's an agreement scale. And the scoring generally is just calculate either the total or take an average of the questions, and 2 or 3 questions together form one construct of the PCPF on the left-hand side that you can see, and 17 of those constructs can then come together to form the 3 domains. So these domains being the prerequisites, practice environment, and person-centered processes. And each of them have different constructs within them, and those constructs then contain different questions that are contained within this inventory. So this is just sort of a background. So I think most of us are probably at this point aware of the strengths of these questionnaires. We have used them in different forms in our research. These questionnaires are valid, they're reliable, they have been tested in different settings, they are very stable as well. So the scores stay over the course of time for one person. As I said, they've been culturally adapted. Researchers at this point are also familiar with it. So familiarity also plays a big role. And they're definitely customizable. So you can take out a few questions and only test a few constructs at a time if you want, or a domain at a time. But there are, of course, some challenges. And I think we've been aware of these challenges for some time. And this is where the conversation revolves around. So one of the biggest challenges is that there are 59 questions, which can easily cause cognitive fatigue in the people who are filling out these questionnaires, especially in a digital format. Emma, you were talking about using this questionnaire before in your research. I'm sure you have come across this as well, where people just your participants would simply say, it's just too many questions to answer. And I think not just from a personal point of view, how you feel about it, but also from a cognitive fatigue point of view. After a point, you'll see a pattern in responses in long questionnaires. If a questionnaire is too long, especially towards the end, people tend to answer similar ratings because they are just over that questionnaire at that point, or they just feel cognitive fatigue. There's also another issue, which is that of social desirability bias. And it's a form of bias where people tend to give higher score to themselves, especially when asked about things that they should be doing in practice. Instructions for this questionnaire are very clear, and they are provided to the participants in multiple ways. So there are multiple ways in which there are already measures in place which try to minimize social desirability bias. However, it still, to some extent, exists. And in our discussion, we found out that majority of this could actually be attributed to a relatively low spread of the rating scale. It goes from 1 to 5, which can often not be enough. So there are simply not enough choices for people to choose from. So if you spread that rating scale, there might be an option for people to then spread those ratings. And I'll explain this in a little bit detail in this slide. So looking at the challenges on the left-hand side, you see a plot which it's got nothing to do with this presentation, but I just wanted to say I generated that on Google Gemini. I asked it a simple statement: can you generate a line plot with negative bias and with number of person-centered practitioners on the y-axis and rating scale on the x-axis, and here was the beautiful result, and I was really impressed. But what this graph essentially shows, or is trying to show, it's obviously fake data, it's generated data by AI. But what it's trying to show here is that majority of the times in questionnaires like PCP-I, people tend to have the positive social desirability bias, where they tend to give more scores, or more, they tend to choose the ratings which are on the higher side of the spectrum, of the rating spectrum. So you'll see that more of the 4 and 5 ratings are being selected, which is why the curve essentially goes more to the right compared to the left. So there are 2 potential things that we could do in future. One is to reduce the number of items, which obviously would help with the cognitive fatigue, but also increasing the spread of the rating scale. For example, going from 5-point scale to a 7-point scale. where people might feel that they have more opportunities, it'll still be more, we'll still find that the spread would be still more towards the positive end of spectrum or the right side of the spectrum. However, it might counter some of the, we might be able to capture the nuances that we might be missing with the 5-point scale. Regarding the first point, just briefly talking about reducing the number of items. There are multiple ways that this can be done, but one of the ways that we believe can be useful is looking at the associations that already exist between different constructs of this framework. So this has been taken from the 2021 paper with McCann et al., where they look at where they examine the theoretical relationships between the constructs. And this particular table is very important. It shows intercorrelations between 17 constructs of the framework within themselves. So you'll see V1 to V17, these are the constructs that are within the framework, and the same constructs then go on the top. And each intersection, so if you follow it along the row and then follow it along the columns, that number goes between 0 and 1. And the closer it is to 1, the more strong that relationship is. For example, between V2 and V1, the number is 0.543. It's a Pearson's correlation coefficient, which means it's somewhere between 0 and 1. And at 0.543, it's quite a strong correlation it shows, moderate to strong correlation. So it basically says that construct number 1 in this paper and construct number 2 are very highly linked together. And just looking at this table, it might not be quite informative, but if we try to look at where the higher relationships or higher correlations are, and those I have circled in this diagram with green, you'll see that there are quite a lot of groupings of these constructs that appear. And this could be actually a really good point to start looking at some of these relationships. So we could essentially say that if, let's say, construct 1 and construct 2 are very closely related to each other, that means that if I capture construct 1, that I'm already capturing at least half of the essence of construct 2 of the framework. So this is another way to look at it, is that construct 2 is still a construct in its own right, and it captures the questions that that construct contains already capture that construct really well, perfectly in fact. But some of the questions that are contained in construct number 1 can also capture a little bit of construct number 2. And so that could be our way to then looking at which of these items essentially could be the most contributing ones in a way where we are able to faithfully capture all of the constructs, all of the 17 constructs of the framework, because that is the ultimate goal, but at the same time reduce the number of items. This could be by merging the items, rephrasing some of the items, or by looking at some of these associations. There are multiple strategies that we are exploring just now, but this is all a work in progress. And I just wanted to introduce this, that this is a line of work that we are pursuing just now. So the idea is essentially the output would be a smaller, shorter version of the PCP-I, which should be able to address some of the challenges that I mentioned before. So at the end, I'll just leave you with 2 questions. The first one being, how do you see this line of work evolving in future? Or where would you want these instruments, where would you like this work to evolve? And second question is, where do you see these instruments being used? So in what context, other than research, of course, do you see these questionnaires being used? With that, I think I'll just open the space up for thoughts, questions, reflections.
And it's so interesting, Webb, like where you're up to and looking at those constructs and the not being particularly strong in the quantitative space. But I found that really interesting that actually there is those correlations, and so there's potential to, maybe reduce the question. So really interested in where that heads in the next little while with your work. Emma, thank you.
Thanks, Beck, and thanks, Webb. I agree. That was my experience in practice with teams using the PCP-IS in terms of the sorry, I just got distracted by a little notification that popped up saying I was done talking. I'm definitely not done talking. Sorry. Yeah, so the PCP-IS was a lengthy survey for staff to complete, and they did make excuses about being too busy or finding it too long. And I'm excited by the possibility, looking at the correlation there of condensing that. I also think the accessibility of it was hard too. So I've worked in environments where we've done it with a paper-based form, and that was collated and sent off and then, brought back to us later. But I wonder if using technology to actually administer the survey would help as well, rather than, as a researcher putting it in Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey back in the day or whatever tool you're using. Is there the possibility to have a centralized space where this could be administered and scored to help people? Because for me, I needed a statistician's help in using it for my PhD and in understanding it. But is there a centralized space? At the moment, I'm engaging in research, which is using a survey called the SDQ, a Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire for young people. And there's a website that people can go download copies of it and actually administer it and have it evaluated through a space like that. So I wonder if we could utilize technology in administering, understanding results, and also sort of in making it a bit more accessible for people completing it and people using the data.
Mm.
That's a great suggestion, Emma. Thank you so much. I think that would be the ideal case for sure. It comes down to the resources, I suppose. It could easily be implemented on the website for sure, and I do manage that space. The only thing I would still worry about is the cognitive fatigue aspect of it, or people just leaving that questionnaire halfway. So we'll still be collecting some important data. So it could be useful for us as researchers for sure, but also useful for people who will be able to access it openly. It is an open source questionnaire. The other worry, and this is again open to discussion, would be that when a questionnaire is open without any copyright protection, which PCP-IS is, it's an open source instrument. However, there are conditions, even for open source instruments, there are conditions attached to it in terms of licensing and copyright and all of that. And for this particular one, original authors do ask that it is referred, and also if it is being adapted, then their permission is explicitly sought. So those are the two challenges that I could see potentially in an online implementation of it and automatic scoring of it. But it's a brilliant suggestion, and that's something definitely once we reduce the number of items, I think Brendan, maybe you and I and the others in the team can sit down and have a think about for sure.
Thank you, Brendan, did you have a question?
Yeah, one was back to you. The first one was around the scaling, because I know, and we haven't talked about this, but I just thought it might be useful for others to hear responses, is around the scaling itself. So you've suggested going from 5 to 7, but I also know there is, as an option, but I also know that there's some debate in the literature about even an uneven scaling, and this problem of the middle ground, the kind of sitting on the fence, and neither of those options, the 5 or the 7, which I remember debating with Paul Slater at length previously, kind of prevent that from happening. And so it also, because you have a middle territory, and statistically it can polarize data, and wondered about the option of not having 5 or 7, but 4 or 6, for example, and just your thoughts on that. But the second question was around the discussion we had about that paper that you just showed the chart for the data from, and our commentary on that was around it. The correlation suggested that some items were unnecessary and all that kind of stuff, but you also had a take on what low correlations mean in relation to strength of the construct, which I found really interesting, and I think other people might too, if you wanted to say something about that.
Thank you, Brendan. I'll start with the second point. I think that point essentially centers around the fact that if looking at the other end of the spectrum, so we looked at some of the questions that are closely related to each other, could suggest that those questions are already they are able to capture more than one construct. So we might be able to get away with using one or two of them. The other side of that is that if two questions are not correlated with each other at all, or have a very low correlation to constructs, then that essentially tells us that both of those constructs are equally important in that framework, and we need to keep both of them in. And I think looking at those associations, so if I refer back to that correlation chart, you'll see that although those groupings exist, there are a lot of other groupings which show that all of those other groupings, where the correlation is low, those constructs are actually, all of those are really important in combining and coming together to form that, or give an understanding of person-centeredness. So that's the other side of the argument as well. High correlations give us an indication of which one of them could be redundant, but low correlations, which is the majority of them, which actually increases the confidence in the framework as well, in the theoretical underpinning, that these constructs do hold value on their own. Some of them might be overlapping, but quite a lot of them, or majority of them, actually need to be studied on their own. In fact, that could be an argument for future study as well, to study them individually and to deconstruct the framework and to see the nuances that are contained within the framework. So that was the discussion that we had around not having strong correlations. And regarding the first point, Brendan, I think I agree that there is, having an uneven scale would be useful, or could be useful in a setting like that. But oftentimes when you have a rating scale like that, people get really confused. That's the major criticism of that side of the story. People really get confused, and they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm neither on this side nor on that side. I neither strongly disagree nor strongly agree. And you haven't really given me a point. So maybe you should give me like, I don't know kind of answer, which then goes into this territory of how do you treat that particular rating. Like when people say, oh, I don't know, that they're simply telling you that actually that for that particular question, you can't use that information that they're giving you because they simply don't know what their response is going to be. So it sort of falls into that territory. So I would always be, which is why majority of the time having an odd scale is preferred over having an even scale, which is why you always see either ratings of 3, 5, or 7. The other side of this argument, just to extend it, could be that what if we have a negative side of the scale? What if we make strongly disagree as -3 or something, and then strongly agree as +3, and then have that spread out with 0 in between? And it has, again, its own limitations and positives. At the end of the day, I think what we're wanting to do is to capture some of the nuances that are within that spread. So positive social bias would always be there. There's no way around it. When you ask people, are you good? People are going to say, I'm very good. There's no way around it. It's how much of that nuance you can capture that sits on the positive side of the spectrum is, I think, what will be crucial going forward.
No, just to come, I get that. I guess partly where I was thinking about was that whole issue, which I think Kelly raised as well, and hers is around the fact that we have such diverse perspectives on person-centeredness, and this kind of that I refer to as one of this implicit knowledge that dominates and which directs people towards the safe space of the neutral, I don't know, or neither agree nor disagree. Whereas by having the even scale, it kind of forces them into a position that may be more authentic, more real, rather than just going, yeah, I know about this and I'm neutral, I neither agree nor this, that kind of thing. So I get people feel uncomfortable with it, but I just wonder if it's a tactic to force people out of that safe zone of, yes, I am person-centered, and of course it is, kind of thing. That's
no, absolutely. No, absolutely. I think potentially another solution could be just moving away from agreement scale, because agreement is what brings in social desirability bias. So going to, let's say, a behavioral scale, we're asking people in the past 6 months or so, how many times did you engage in this behavior, kind of thing. There are multiple ways of tackling it. They all have strengths and limitations, and this is definitely like we can we should sit down and have like a proper discussion about this, and we will. I'm sure we will in future. But this was just as an introduction for people to see that this is the direction we are aiming to take.
Thank you. Great stimulating conversation from both Kelly and you, Webb, and thank you so much for your presentations. And there's some good comments in the chat as well. Kelly, I particularly like yours, neutrality screens indifference. Yeah, few of us agree with that. So thank you both again.